So I have the pleasure of introducing James Meadowcroft. He is a Canada Research Chair in Governance for Sustainable Development. He's a professor at the School of Public Policy and Administration in the Department of Political Science at Carleton University. And he focuses his research on reforms to structures and processes of governance in order to promote the transition towards sustainability and sustainable energy policy. He's also authored books like Catching the Carbon, The Politics and Policy of Carbon Capture and Storage. And I met him 16 years ago and used to have often dinner with him in Sheffield, across the water in the United Kingdom. So it's a great pleasure that he's here again. I'd like to welcome James Meadowcroft to talk with us about pushing the boundaries, governance for sustainable development, and a politics of limits. James.
Okay, well, it's great to be here and to have this chance to talk to you. First, I'm just going to see if this little... Did you do that?
I did. I'm worried that it's not going to work anyway. Keep going.
Okay, so this is kind of a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about. The title is Pushing the Boundaries, Governance for Sustainable Development and Politics of Limits. And essentially, as you'll see, what I'm interested in is exploring this idea of limits in environmental discourse and looking at some of its kind of practical implications. So those are the four kind of sub-areas that I'm going to talk about. Now let me try to do it. Yes, okay, so a couple of words, but I have to kind of look that way. Point that way. Okay, so very briefly in introduction, so here when I'm talking about the politics of limits, what I'm talking about really is the character of political argument and action, about what I didn't do that. About what governments actually do, how they're organized, and talking about the culture and spirit of political life. I can see it there. Okay. Still very little business. So I'm going to talk about the general notion of what we might mean by politics of limits and its basic parameters. I'm not going to go into particular policies, whether it means a carbon tax at so many dollars a ton and so on. And basically the idea of this is to kind of set the stage for your workshop. So my discussion is at a broad level, and at the end I say a little bit about consumption, but you guys are far more experts and thought a lot more about this issue of sustainable consumption than I do, so I won't trespass on that. Okay, so I want to start with the question of limits in environmental discourse. It's pretty obvious that the idea of limits is really central to argument and discussion around the environment and also to policy prescriptions. If we think of so many of what our actual rules and regulations and laws are about the environment, they're about boundaries. Boundaries around a protected space. Prohibitions that you can't dump more than so much of this kind of pollutant into the atmosphere and so on. So they're really all about limits. And I want to briefly just point to kind of two key texts. And considering this is such an environmentally literate audience, you probably all read them and know their significance. But just think about them. Both these really critical texts, the idea of limits play a very important role, though a slightly different one in each of the two. I'm not going, because I know you know them, I'm not going to summarize or even attempt to situate them more than just refer briefly. But I guess one point I want to emphasize is that very often these two documents are kind of played off one against the other, with the idea of the limits to growth being perhaps more pessimistic, more absolute, whereas the Brundtland Report is thought to be kind of gives a positive spin. What we need is a different kind of development. And of course the Brundtland Report also acknowledges the need for economic, they talk about revitalizing economic growth, particularly in developing countries. So often they're played off one against the other. But the point I want to make really is that there actually are deep similarities between the perspectives of these documents. And particularly I've pointed out three there. That both of them talk about human beings aspiring for ends other than just material satisfaction. And that's present in the limits to growth as well as, of course, in the Brundtland notion of development. Both of them make a distinction between the rich countries and the poor countries and acknowledge that we need lots of good old-fashioned economic development in the poor countries. And both of them also talk about absolute limits. Though there are more nuances in the Brundtland report, it does talk about absolute limits which our societies must come to respect. Very briefly, if we look at environmental discourse basically since the 1970s, the idea of limits appear in a number of quite distinct ways. Very often they're mixed up in argument. So if you read in the limits of growth, you can find all these limits on one page. And yet they're not the same thing. So I just want to untangle them because I think it's important to do so. So the first, and what you could perhaps call the base thing, is the idea of limits as ecological constraints. So the idea is that there are physical limits which, if we cross, are either going to provoke a change in the ecosystem or perhaps serious consequences for human beings who depend on that ecosystem. And you can apply this at different scales, from what is the toxic level of lead in the blood to how much CO2 can we put into the atmosphere without causing serious climate change. But this is very much the idea of constraints over and against us, something our society bumps up if it comes up against ecological frontiers. There's a second idea of limits, which is slightly more abstract, but this is the idea of limits to the human capacity to control nature. So this is about cognitive limits, about complexity, about uncertainty. The idea, simply put, is that we can't engineer natural systems like we could a combustion plant or something like that, and that nature surprises us constantly. And if we try to control too much, well, we get bitten in the end. Then there's a third level, which kind of limits, which I've described here as the potential of the existing development model to meet human needs. But this is very much more about the limits, you could call it the limits to materialism. The limits to material satisfaction as being able to meet all of humans' needs. And also, of course, the problem with the current development model in meeting the needs of all human beings, not just those in rich countries, but those in poor countries as well. And then there's this fourth level, which is the idea of limits as self-restraint, which you can think about in relation to each of those other three kinds of limits. Now, to some extent, this is partly the solution to the other three. But it's the idea of self-limitation, which could be for prudential reasons, because we'll suffer and it'll be bad for our kids if we don't, but it also can be for moral or ethical reasons. It's not right to treat animals that way. So these four slightly distinct ideas, all in them, limits play a key role. And together they're woven into modern environmental discourse. And they're combined in very different ways in different perspectives. So depending on the particular understanding of each of those kinds of limits, you end up with different kinds of environmental thought, from Greenpeace to, well, pick your gamut, eco-communalism or